I was thinking just the other day about, I don't know anything about your grandfather.
Well, I must confess, I know a lot about one of my grandfathers. I don't know too much about the other one. See, my father, first of all, you know, because I think I gave you a paper some time ago which showed this, that the Quins with one N are a very, very old Irish family. They date straight back to Bran Baru, who was the King of Ireland in 713, which means to say that we're now some 1285 years old, which is a fairly long lineage. Of course, as we've come down, there have been many branches of the same family, but nevertheless, the Quins with one N, as opposed to the Quins with two, because there are lots of Quins with two, the Quins with one N are a very, very old family. I don't know much about the Quins with two. I think they were more modern. My father's father, my father was born in Thurles, in Tipperary.
He was born in Ireland?
In Ireland, yes. And from what I know about his father was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. That is to say, he came from a wealthy family. My grandmother, my father's mother, was a Stuart Scot, and therefore in lineage she descended from the Buccleuch family in Scotland. But he seems to have taken off and left her fairly early in life, after giving her two children, my father and his sister, who went to Australia when she was grown up, and whom I've never met. She married a chap called Patterson, who is a sheep farmer in Australia, but I've never been able to find out where they are. And since my mother didn't know, and nobody could tell me, there was nothing I could do about it. But his father certainly went off to seek his fame and fortune in the world outside. And from what I gather, he just disappeared and nobody ever heard of him again. My father's mother must have been reasonably well off, because she lived in a large house on the common, on the old common at Chislehurst in Kent, which is an old town. And I can remember as a little boy going down to stay there. It was a dark, rather spooky house. And the only saving grace with it was that my grandmother had a cook who cooked wonderful fried potatoes and bacon for breakfast. And I remember that, and I can remember two little boys living at the house next door and playing with them in the dell, which was one of those secret hidey places, and which was great fun for young kids to play in.
So you never
in woodland, you know.
So you never met your grandfather?
No, never.
But you met your grandmother?
Oh yes.
Now, when was your grandmother born?
Well, I don't know when she was born, but she died when I was quite young. She died probably when I was away at school at the time, and I must have been about, I forget, 11 or 12.
You see, she was probably, and you were born when?
I was born in 1920.
So she was probably born in 1870 or something?
Oh, something like that, yes. Right. Yes. Because she was a fairly elderly lady. Mind you, I think that the privations of what had happened to her made her older. She was very nice, she was very quiet, very reserved, a very nice person.
Okay, and then your father married.
Well, my other family, my mother's family, their name was Hecht, H-E-C-H-T. Now, her father, Emil Hecht, my other grandfather, came from Bratislava in Moravia, when he was about 18 years old, which would be in the sort of 1860s, 70s, 1870s, I suppose, 1860s, 70s, I think. And he was the son of a country solicitor, and I suppose that's how you would describe him, a country lawyer,
right,
in Bratislava, Moravia. And he decided to seek his fortune outside of Moravia, Czechoslovakia, as it was then outside of, I suppose, the realm of
Russian.
no, it was oh dear, what was the name of the fellow who got killed in Sarajevo?
Archduke, the Austrians.
Yes, who got killed.
Archduke Ferdinand.
Yes, that's right. And he came to London, and he had an introduction to a friend who was in the city of London, and he worked for him for a while, and then he decided to set up his own business, which was, strictly speaking, in the business of buttons and bows. And although it sounds silly, it became a very large and thriving business, because in those days women wore very elegant clothes which needed lots of buttons and bows. And he became a very rich man. And interestingly, since he was a Jew and came from overseas, he became a freeman of the city of London, which is very unusual for a Jewish emigrant. And he...
How many children did he have?
He had, let's see, he had one son who was killed in the Frank, who was killed in the First World War. He had another son, Godfrey, who came on to run the family business after he left. And then he had 3 daughters. Dorothy, Rogie, and your mother.
Her grandmother.
Yeah, your grandmother, rather.
Right.
And Rogie never married. Dorothy married and had her children, which were Vincent and Deborah, who in turn, Vincent got killed in the Second World War.
Right.
And Deborah had 2 or 3 children, I can't remember. One of whom was Ambrose. Another, I can't remember too much. I can't remember too much about the others because I never saw very much of them. And after the early years, and because the Second World War, we were we were long distance apart during that period. And then you had a question.
Well, I was going to say, tell me about you growing up and your father, what you know about him, your father and mother.
Well, my father was a very nice man. He was, unfortunately, a very uncommunicative man. I think he found it difficult to communicate, but he was a nice and kind man. He, when I was born, I was born in St. John's Wood, and we lived in the road leading down from the army barracks there. And the army barracks housed, in those days, and still does, the King's Troop of the Royal Horse Artillery, who are the chaps who go to Hyde Park, and you see them on television firing the royal salutes. And my father was in charge of that battery when I was there, commanded that battery. He had served in the Second World War. He'd been
First World War.
In the First World War, I beg your pardon. He had been wounded he'd suffered some gassy, which was very common, which was very bad for people. But he had great trouble with his legs, like me, and he came back from the war. Then he was sent. He was in the Royal Horse Artillery, of course, and he was a brevet major and then a major in the Royal Horse Artillery. And it's very funny. I have a friend, Charles March, who's now the Duke of but anyway, when I knew him, he was the Earl of March, and he's now the Duke of somewhere or other. Anyway, he was very much concerned with the Royal Horse Artillery, and one of view of his dukedom, etc. Honorary, he'd been an honorary colonel and God knows what. And he looked up all the records for me, which was very interesting.
Oh, about your dad. Great.
And my father eventually, I was born in 1920, and soon after that, he retired from the army. I mean, I don't think he had any option about it because they were disbanding the army. But he'd done his time. He'd even spent a period fighting the Black and Tans, or fighting the Irish in Ireland, or even though he was Irish, because there are lots of, there are a great many Irishmen in the British Army, and he was ordered out there. He had to obey his orders,
And then he became a stockbroker, right?
Pardon?
Then he became a stockbroker, right?
Then yes, and then he became a stockbroker, and he worked with a well-known London firm of stockbrokers. His senior partner I met as a little boy was a man called Edgar Pater, and they were quite a successful firm. And then Pater died, and I think the firm split up. My father went into business on his own. That was just before the Second World War, and it wasn't a very good time.
Hang on one second. Here we go. All right, so where you left off was that...
Had I described how we went home, the various places we stopped at,
Yes.
how we finally got at Poole Harbour?
Yes, I think you did.
Yes, right.
So what I want to pick up with is, after that, you got home and try and cover the period of your life, through meeting Mummy and so on.
Yeah.
And what you did after the war.
What I did when I came home?
Yeah. What happened with life?
Well, it's interesting because as a result of being the only person who could talk about anything from Poole Harbour, what I had to say about the prison camps was reported in most of the newspapers, and the Evening Standard had me do a really big story, because that was the paper I worked for before the war and in the early part of the war, and they had me do a really big story, and I realized that I hadn't lost any of my so-called journalistic ability through being in a prison camp. And I didn't feel too bad at all. I felt in pretty good shape. And I got, as a result of all these things, I got offered a job on the Daily Mail. And so I went to work for them. I had to go, first of all, see the army and get demobbed. And I went and got my suit of clothes and the various things they gave you on being demobbed, and I was looked at by the doctors because I come out of a prison camp. And they looked at me and they said, well, you don't seem to be in too bad shape compared with some of these people we've seen out there. We think you'll probably live till you're 60. Without it, you know, you might not live a lot longer than that after your experience, but you should live at least until you're 60. So I collected whatever it was I got. I think it was some gratuity, not very much, and the clothes free, and off I went. And I went to work for the Daily Mail. Originally they had the ideas of sending me as a war correspondent to Germany. And they even sent me to get the necessary clothes. But then the situation changed fairly fast, and they didn't need any more people out there, so they said, well, you stay in London. So I became a young reporter on the Daily Mail in a position which I'd really never been in before, because this was a national daily newspaper as opposed to an evening newspaper. But I went at it, I did all the usual things, and it wasn't too long afterwards. I was in a situation where I was meeting fairly regularly with a chap called Mo Demir, who had been he was an officer in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and he was a prisoner. We were all prisoners together, you see. And we used to meet at the at Claridge's Hotel, because he was the nephew of the Duke of Alva, who was a famous Spanish international character with lots of money. And Mo Demir was staying at the at Claridge's, so we met there in the bar, and they got to know me fairly well because I went in and out all the time. And one day, the news editor of the Daily Mail, who was a famous character in those days, called Lyndon Lang, who always carried large sums of money with him and never handed any change to anybody, and always paid tenors or fivers for everything, you know, and that was big money in those days. And he said to me, look, I want you to go and see if you can get a story from King Peter of Yugoslavia, who's staying at Claridge's and who's just been deposed by Tito Brozovic, who was the head of the underground, you know, the people who were resistance in Yugoslavia, who fought the Germans through the war.
Right.
And he had thrown out King Peter of Yugoslavia because they didn't want him to come back. And he was at Claridge's. He was being looked after by on the Foreign Office instructions. I think probably on the King's instructions by the Earl of Dudley, who was responsible for his welfare. And so I went with a Daily Mail photographer, well-known Daily Mail photographer, whose name I forget now, and we went to Claridge's. And because I knew the doorman and the concierge and all these people, and I said, I want to go off and see King Peter of Yugoslavia, which suite is he in? And they told me, and I went, up we went. And we were asked into the suite, and there was this young man, I thought rather a vacuous young man, really, but his wife I thought was very nice and very pretty, and much more of a personality than he was. Mm-hmm. And we had a conversation, and he told me that Peter had thrown him out, and he said, it's a terrible situation for me. There's not much left now after all this. And then we got the pictures and everything, and a few more quotes from him. And then Dudley said, well, I think all the world's press is assembling downstairs and we don't want to have that, so I'm going to take you out, Your Majesty, through the kitchens so that we can get out without anybody seeing us. So off they went, and I and the photographer went downstairs, and we saw everybody else we knew downstairs. And
you scooped the world.
Oh no, they just thought we were just more of the crowd, so to speak. So we walked out quietly, very mum, got in a taxi and went back to the office. And I wrote my piece, and the Daily Mail had an absolute copper-bottom world beat. Nobody else could touch it. And they sold it all over the world. And the next day...
Scoop.
Huh?
Scoop.
Oh, big scoop, yes. And I think it's the only one I really got, really big one in my life. But
do you have a cover of the front page? Do you have a copy of it?
I think I've got it somewhere. Yes, I've got all this stuff put away somewhere. And the next day, Lyndon Lang came over to me and he said, well, it was a good show. He said, you know how to do a swindle sheet? He said, I tell you what, you see so-and-so pointing to a weather-beaten lady reporter nearby. He said, ask her how to do it, you know? So I think it cost, the whole thing had cost me, in terms of the money in those days, about, with the taxi and everything, about 8 shillings and 6pence, you see. And by the time she'd finished with me, I had it up to 50-odd quid, which was quite a lot of money. And he paid me too.
Yeah,
you know, he was quite happy. That was his idea of, you know, giving you a bonus for doing a good job. And that was really my high point. I stayed with I was with the Daily Mail through 1946 and into 1947, but then there was a tremendous squeeze on paper. There was very little paper for newspapers, and they cut down the sizes, and they cut down the staff, and the last in were the first out. And so I lost my job for that reason, because they just had to get rid of people. And I looked round for something else to do, and I had this idea of writing something about my experiences. And I'd met a chap on the BBC. Of course, this was radio in those days, because there was no television. And he was a producer, and we got talking about it.
Yeah.
And he said, why don't you give me a précis of what you might do, and we'll see what we can do with it. So I did that, and he came back to me and said, right, and I write the whole thing. So I wrote the story, and I wrote it, I've still got the script. As you, well, you know, because
right.
More than that, you did the story, so you've got it. And as you know, it was broadcast, and it was a considerable success at the time, and I got all the write-ups and everything somewhere. It's all put away. I went to work for the BBC. I did quite a bit of work for the BBC. I wrote all sorts of radio programs on different subjects. I remember I did a thing called Focus on Foreigners in Britain, pointing out people who come, who'd escaped from before the war and in the early part of the war from the European countries, and had been given the opportunity to set up their businesses in parts of England where there was depression, and unemployment, and how many of them had been successful, and the new industries they brought to the country, and so on. I did a lot of those sorts of things, which were, interesting, or in a limited way, but provided me with the necessary income. And then I had met this girl on the Evening Standard, and the work that I'd done for the Evening Standard, and who is the daughter of the news editor, famous news editor of the Daily Express, a chap called Morley Richards, who became a great friend of mine.
Oh, I remember.
You remember him?
Yes.
And we decided to get married. And we got married, and I went to work through Morley. I got a job as press officer with the International Wool Secretariat, which is something I'd never done before, but it was quite interesting, quite a well-paid job.
How old were you at this point?
How
old were you?
25, 26. And
Sit. Now, where were you?
okay, so and we lived in we had a flat, an apartment on New Cavendish Street, in the West End of London, and we used to go weekends. We used to go down to Baldock in Essex, to a pub where Morley went and met with his wife, from whom he was separated. She was living with somebody else, and they all met together, and various people came down from the Daily Express. This was, of course, the period, the great heyday of the Daily Express, which was a broadsheet in those days.
Right.
It was Lord Beaverbrook's top newspaper.
Right.
And it was full of, famous characters. I mean, there was Clive Graham, who was the racing correspondent.
Right.
I think I described him earlier when I
Lauren, come on, sweetie. Be quiet now. In fact, hang. Okay, sorry.
And
Clive Graham.
yeah, and I think I described him earlier when I went through Calcutta. He met me there, but he was one of these incredible characters. I think I described then that he went to work for the Daily Express because he was offered Eton, and he made a book because he was interested in the horses and racing as a schoolboy, and his book was a great success.
Keep going.
Except when the headmaster of Eton found out, he got expelled, sent down, and Beaverbrook heard of this and thought he was a very ingenious chap, and sent for him and offered him a job. And he became, as I say, the famous racing correspondent of the Daily Express. There were a lot of small people like that who were well known in international journalism. And we used to foregather at this pub and spend the weekend there and have a very uproarious time. And then we came back and went to work, and she was, my then wife was a very nice girl, and she was a very good journalist for many years, just like her father, working on the Evening Standard.
Okay.
What's the question?
You're just coming up to 80 years.
What?
You're just